When I was going through my late husband's books, a task I had been putting off for 3 months because I simply could not face it, I found a USB drive taped to the inside back cover of his old HVAC technical manual. Beneath it, a sticky note in his handwriting. "Watch this alone. Before you do anything else, watch this alone. Do not show our son." Those 8 words changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about the last 2 years of my marriage. Good day, dear listeners. It's Emma here, and I'm so glad you've joined me today. Please stay with me until the end, and when you're done, leave me a comment telling me what city you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. My name is Rowena, and I am 66 years old. I was married to Jerome for 41 years. We built our life in Roanoke, Virginia, in a brick ranch house on a street where the neighbors still wave and the summers smell like cut grass, and something sweet from the bakery 2 blocks over. Jerome was an HVAC contractor. Not glamorous work, he always said, but honest work, and he believed in honest work the way some men believe in church. He retired at 68. We planted a vegetable garden. We argued about whose turn it was to make the coffee. We took a trip to the Smoky Mountains for our 40th anniversary, and he burned the marshmallows over the campfire, and we laughed about it until we both had tears in our eyes. He died in October. A heart attack, while he was sitting in his recliner watching football. The paramedics said it was fast. I told myself that was a mercy. But mercy is a complicated word when you are suddenly alone in a house that still smells like the man who filled it for 4 decades. The weeks after the funeral moved in a strange way. Not fast, not slow, sideways, somehow. People brought casseroles. My daughter flew in from Denver and stayed for 10 days and then had to go back to her children and her life. My son and his wife lived 20 minutes away and came by often in those first weeks, at least at first. It was my son's wife who asked almost immediately whether Jerome had left a will, which he had. It was my son's wife who asked whether the estate attorney had been in touch, which he had not yet. It was my son's wife who offered, twice in the first month, to help me organize Jerome's financial paperwork because she was a CPA and these things had timelines and she wanted to make sure nothing got complicated. I thanked her. I said I would let her know. I had been married to Jerome long enough to understand that the things a person volunteers immediately after a death sometimes have less to do with grief and more to do with urgency. Those 2 things can look identical from the outside. I had learned, over 4 decades, to watch for the difference. Jerome's study was the last room I went into. It was a practical room. Drafting table, 2 bookshelves, a filing cabinet the color of old pewter, and a collection of technical manuals he had accumulated over 40 years in the trade. I had always teased him about those manuals. He never threw one away. He said a man should know where his information came from. I worked through the room slowly, the way you work through grief, which is to say not in a straight line and not on any schedule. I sorted papers. I opened folders. I sat in his chair for stretches of time doing nothing useful at all. It was in the 3rd week of November, a gray Tuesday afternoon, that I pulled the old HVAC manual from the bottom shelf, a thick, spiral-bound thing he had carried since before we met, and felt that the weight of it was wrong, heavier in the back than it should have been. I turned to the inside back cover. The USB drive was small and black, taped flush against the cardboard with 2 strips of electrical tape. Jerome's handwriting on the sticky note was the same handwriting I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the deed to our house for more than 4 decades. I knew that handwriting the way I knew his voice. Watch this alone. Before you do anything else, watch this alone. Do not show our son. Not you don't need to show our son. Not this is private. Do not show our son. A warning is not the same as a suggestion, and Jerome had been precise with language his entire life. I sat down on the study floor. I did not know I was going to do that. I read the note 4 times. Then I put the manual back on the shelf, made dinner, ate alone, and did not sleep at all. The next morning, I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. Jerome had filmed himself at his desk. He was wearing the green flannel shirt I had bought him 2 Christmases ago, which meant this had been recorded sometime in the last 18 months of his life. He looked tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time without telling anyone about the weight. He said hello. He said he was sorry to be doing it this way. He said there were things he needed to tell me that he had not been able to say out loud, because saying them out loud would have required him to act on them, and he had been afraid. Then he told me what he had found. 14 months before he died, Jerome had been reviewing our retirement accounts the way he did every quarter, with the same methodical attention he brought to everything in his life. He noticed a discrepancy in one of the accounts, a joint investment account we had opened in 1992, intended in its entirety to become mine after he was gone. That account had been restructured 2 years prior through a process Jerome had not fully understood at the time, and our son had been granted co-signatory access as part of what was presented as routine estate planning. What Jerome found was not routine. Over the course of 14 months, money had been moving out of that account in regular withdrawals, calculated carefully, never large enough individually to trigger an automatic bank review, always routed through a secondary account before arriving at its final destination. That destination, which Jerome had traced through bank statements he obtained, printed and organized with the same precision he brought to his trade manuals, was a business entity registered under his daughter-in-law's maiden name, a tax consulting LLC that had, as far as Jerome could determine, no actual clients and no actual work product. The total he had documented was approximately $180,000. He had not confronted our son. He said in the video that he had started to, twice, and stopped both times because he could not bear what it would mean if it were true. He had been hoping to find an explanation that was not the obvious one. He never did. He had instead spent the last 14 months of his life building a case, the way he had always built things, methodically, completely, following the evidence until there was nowhere else for it to go. He was an HVAC contractor who had spent 40 years diagnosing systems by tracing what should have been there and wasn't. He knew how to document a failure. He documented this one. He told me there was a manila envelope in the desk drawer with account statements, printed correspondence, and a notarized letter he had prepared. Everything was also on the USB drive in a folder labeled Rowena. Read first. Near the end of the video, he said, "I was a coward about this. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting the family. I understand now that what I was really doing was protecting myself from a truth I didn't want to be true. You are braver than I was. You always were. Trust what you find." I watched the video twice. Then I opened the folder on the drive and read everything he had left me. He was thorough. He had always been thorough. The account statements went back 31 months and told a story so clear and consistent it would have been almost tedious if it had not been so devastating. The correspondence Jerome had saved showed a level of premeditation that made the account statements look like a rough draft. One email discussed the transfer structure as clean and defensible. Another discussed completing the larger movements of funds before any estate review could be triggered. The most recent email in the chain was dated 11 days before Jerome died. I sat at that desk for 2 hours. I photographed every page on my phone. I uploaded everything to a cloud folder. Then I closed the laptop and sat very still, and I thought about all the phone calls my daughter-in-law had made since October. The constant, helpful, practical phone calls, the offers to help with the paperwork, the questions about timelines, the offer twice to review the financial documents herself because she was a CPA, and these things could get complicated. That evening, I called my daughter in Denver, not to tell her what I had found. I was not ready for that, but because I needed to hear a voice I trusted without reservation. She talked about the kids, about the early snow they'd had in Colorado, about a book she was reading. She asked how I was. I said I was managing. Which was true, in the way that managing is always true when you are doing something far more difficult than managing. Over the next 3 days, I made a list of estate attorneys in Roanoke. I checked each one against every professional connection I could trace to my son or his wife. I eliminated 2. I found a woman named Ms. Vickers who had been practicing estate and probate law for 26 years. Her reviews described her as thorough and, in one particularly useful phrase, not intimidated by complicated family situations. I called her office on a Thursday morning and made an appointment for Monday. The second thing I did was nothing. I answered my daughter-in-law's calls with the same calm I had used for 40 years. I said the paperwork was coming along. I said I was not overwhelmed. I thanked her for asking. It was on Saturday that I noticed her car on my street. She drove a white Lexus. It was parked 3 houses down from mine when I went to get the mail, and gone 20 minutes later when I looked again. It may have been coincidence, but I noted it the way Jerome would have noted an anomaly in a system reading. Not with panic, with attention. That evening she called again. The tone had shifted. Still warm, still helpful, but with something underneath it now that I might not have caught a month earlier. She said she was thinking of coming by to help go through Jerome's study, just to make sure nothing got accidentally misplaced before the estate was sorted. I told her I had already been through the study. A pause, brief and present. Oh, had I found everything in order? I said I had found everything I needed. Another pause. Of course, she was just making sure I wasn't overwhelmed. I thanked her and ended the call. My heart was doing something unsteady in my chest, but my voice had been even throughout, and that felt like a small but important victory. Monday morning, I drove downtown and sat across from Ms. Vickers in an office with a view of the Blue Ridge Mountains and told her everything. I brought the printed documents. I brought my phone with the photographs. I brought the USB drive. She listened without interrupting. She reviewed the materials in front of me for a long time. Then she looked up. "Your husband built you a very solid foundation," she said. "What happened here is not ambiguous. The question is how thoroughly you want to pursue it." I told her I wanted to pursue it completely. She moved quickly. Within 72 hours, she had filed a formal contest of the account modifications and submitted a referral to the Virginia Board of Accountancy. She also flagged a potential IRS issue. The LLC registered in my daughter-in-law's maiden name had received funds that had not been properly reported as income. That, Ms. Vickers told me, was a separate matter now, and it would be handled by people with considerably more authority than either of us. It was the estate attorney's formal letter, sent to all parties with a legal interest in Jerome's estate, that let my son know I had retained counsel. That is standard procedure in Virginia. It is also, I discovered, an effective test of whether a person's conscience is clear. My son called 4 days later. His voice was doing the thing it did when he was working very hard to seem in control of something he was not in control of. Too measured, too careful. He said he was calling because he was concerned. He said retaining a lawyer without talking to the family first was going to make things complicated. He said there were things about those accounts that I didn't fully understand, that his father had agreed to certain arrangements, that if I would just let them explain. I said I had read Jerome's documentation. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence, not thoughtful. The silence of someone whose footing has shifted under them without warning. Then his wife came on the line. She had been there the whole time, which told me everything I needed to know about who had organized that call. She said my name the way she always said it, carefully, with just enough warmth to suggest we were closer than we actually were. She said I was misunderstanding what I had found. She said Jerome had been confused in his last years, that there had been verbal agreements, conversations I hadn't been part of. She said that if I pursued this, I would damage my relationship with my son, with my grandchildren, with what was left of our family. I said if the verbal agreements existed, she would have no difficulty demonstrating that to an auditor. She said I was making an enormous mistake for a woman in my position. I asked what my position was. She did not answer that directly. She said that legal proceedings at my age for this amount of money would cost me more than they were worth. That I should think about what I actually needed versus I thought I was owed. That there were ways to resolve this quietly that would be better for everyone. I thought about Jerome in that green flannel shirt, filming himself alone in his study because he was too afraid to say the words out loud. I thought about 14 months of him carrying this by himself. I said, "Please direct any further communication to Ms. Vickers." And I ended the call. I sat in Jerome's armchair for a long time afterward. My hands, when I finally looked at them, were completely still. I was surprised by that. I had expected to be shaking. The letter arrived 10 days later, delivered by my son, who left it in the mailbox and drove away without knocking. He did not ring the doorbell. That told me more about the state of his conscience than anything he might have said face to face. The letter proposed a private settlement of $50,000, described as a voluntary family contribution, in exchange for my withdrawal of all proceedings. It included a line about how a prolonged legal process would be difficult for a woman at my stage of life. That phrase, "at my stage of life," appeared twice. Once might have been careless. Twice was a strategy. I brought the letter to Ms. Vickers. She read it without expression, then set it down. 50,000, she said, against 180. I said yes. They're calculating that you'll be tired enough to take it. I told her they had miscalculated. She allowed herself a small, precise smile. That's what I thought. I had a friend named Lucinda. We had known each other for 32 years, since we had both served on the same church committee and discovered over a folding table that we shared an identical impatience with people who called meetings without having anything to say. She was 64, a retired nurse, a widow herself since her husband had passed 3 years prior, and she had a quality I had come to value more than almost anything else in another person. She did not perform comfort. She just showed up. I called her on a Sunday in December and told her everything. I had not told anyone else, not the neighbors, not my book club, not my daughter yet. But keeping it entirely to myself had started to feel like a weight I was carrying in my chest. She listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Rowena, that woman has been waiting for Jerome to die for years." I asked how she could know that. She said, "The way she watched the room at family gatherings, like she was counting." I thought about that for a long time. I thought about all the holiday dinners and birthday cookouts where my daughter-in-law had moved through our house with that particular quality of attention. Helpful, efficient, present, and somehow always aware of what things cost. She had been assessing. I had simply not known what she was assessing toward. They came together on a Saturday morning in January. I saw the white Lexus in my driveway from the kitchen window while I was making coffee. They had not called. I thought about what that meant before I opened the door. My son's expression was the one he had perfected as a teenager, open, sincere, designed to suggest that everything could still be worked out between reasonable people. He held a bakery box from the place on Jefferson Street that I had always liked, and he held it out with both hands. I let them in. I set the box on the counter. I made coffee. I poured myself a cup, sat in the armchair that had been Jerome's, and waited. My son spoke for 12 minutes. He said he was sorry for how things had been. He said he and his wife had been under enormous financial pressure. His wife's business had not performed the way they had hoped. They had 2 kids, a mortgage, unexpected medical bills. He told himself that the money was coming to us eventually anyway, that his father had understood, that it was just a matter of timing. He did not say the word theft. He said arrangement. He said temporary reallocation. He said Dad knew. He said all of it to the coffee table, to his own hands, to the window, everywhere except to me. Then his wife leaned forward. Her voice dropped into that register of intimacy she had always been skilled at deploying, warm, woman to woman, calibrated to make me feel understood. She said she knew what a terrible year this had been. She said I deserved peace. She said the last thing anyone wanted was for me to spend whatever time and energy I had left on lawyers and courtrooms instead of with my grandchildren. She said if I dropped the proceedings, they would make it right in a way that worked for everyone. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about Jerome alone in his study, pressing record on his phone, recording a message he was too afraid to deliver in person. I thought about what it had cost him to carry that by himself. I was not going to let it mean nothing. I set down my coffee cup. I said, "The documented amount is $180,000. Your letter offered 50. When you say you will make it right, what figure, specifically, did you have in mind?" Her expression shifted the way weather shifts, gradually and then completely. She said this was not a negotiation in my living room. I said she was correct. That was what Ms. Vickers was for. My son looked at me then, actually looked at me, not at his wife, not at the floor, but at me, and for one moment he looked like my son. Not the man who had left that letter in my mailbox without knocking, but the boy who had cried at his father's grave, who had called me from college when he was homesick, who had sat beside me at the kitchen table learning to do his own taxes the first time. I had loved that boy completely. I still did, in the way you still love something that has been broken, carefully, and with the knowledge that some things cannot be put back exactly as they were. Then the look closed like a shutter. His wife stood. She picked up the bakery box from the counter with a deliberateness that was, I thought, the most honest thing she had done all morning. She was taking back what she had brought. They left. I heard the Lexus back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. I sat in Jerome's chair for a few minutes. Then I called Lucinda. The hearing was in March in a civil courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Roanoke City Courthouse. Ms. Vickers had spent the preceding weeks preparing me with the precision she brought to everything. She walked me through the account records, the email chain, the LLC registration, the tax discrepancies that had triggered a parallel IRS review proceeding separately. She told me what to expect from their attorney. Verbal agreements, mutual understanding, no intent to conceal. She told me what Jerome's documentation would do to that argument. "The evidence does the talking," she said the afternoon before. "You just have to sit still and let it." I dressed carefully that morning. I arrived before they did. I folded my hands on the table and waited. They came in together, my son slightly behind his wife, as he always was now. Their attorney arranged his papers with the ease of a man who had not fully assessed what he was walking into. He opened by arguing verbal agreements and family understanding. He was confident and smooth. He was describing a house of cards as though it were a foundation. Ms. Vickers' opening was quieter and half the length of his. She presented Jerome's documentation in chronological order, exhibit by exhibit, without editorializing. I watched the judge, a man in his early 60s with reading glasses on a chain, and the particular stillness of someone who had sat in that room for a long time and heard every version of every story, and I watched pen. It moved more when Ms. Vickers was speaking. My daughter-in-law was called first. She was composed, deliberate, consistent with the verbal agreement narrative, skilled at speaking of Jerome with a warmth she wore like a well-selected piece of clothing. She used the word family frequently. Ms. Vickers cross-examined her with 3 emails from the chain Jerome had documented. The first used the phrase asset protection timeline. The second referred to completing transfers before any formal estate review could be triggered. The third, dated 11 days before Jerome died, discussed ensuring the LLC structure was airtight before complications arise. Ms. Vickers asked her to explain how that language was consistent with an openly agreed-upon family arrangement. She said it was informal language, professional shorthand, taken out of context. Ms. Vickers asked her to identify the signature on the account modification form, the co-authorization line that was supposed to carry my signature, the signature that was not mine. She said there may have been a processing error. Ms. Vickers asked whether she was familiar with the Virginia statute on unauthorized signature. For the first time, she looked at my son. He was looking at the table. That moment, her turning toward him and finding nothing there, held a completeness that the ruling would only confirm in formal language later. My son testified next. He corroborated her version of events. But when Ms. Vickers asked him to describe the specific conversation in which his father had explicitly agreed to the transfers, his account differed from hers in two material details: the date of the conversation and whether anyone else had been present. Ms. Vickers placed both versions side by side on her legal pad and asked him to explain the discrepancy. He looked at the table. "Did your father," Ms. Vickers said, "ever, in your direct presence, explicitly authorize the transfer of retirement funds into a business entity registered under your wife's name?" He was quiet for several seconds. He said, he understood what we were doing. Ms. Vickers said, "That is not what I asked." The room was very still. Outside, March was doing what it always does in Virginia, cold and indifferent and entirely uninterested in the matters of human beings and what they do to one another. I breathed. I thought about the vegetable beds in the backyard that would need turning in 6 weeks. I thought about Jerome. The ruling came 5 weeks later. I was in Ms. Vickers' office when the document arrived. She read it in silence, her expression professionally still. Then she looked at me. "Full restitution," she said. $180,000 plus your legal costs. A pause. "The court has also accepted the referral to the Virginia Board of Accountancy, and the IRS review proceeds separately." I sat with that for a moment. Outside her window, the downtown buildings held the late morning light the way they do in spring. Plainly, without ceremony, as though nothing particularly significant had just occurred. I thought about Jerome at his desk in that green flannel shirt, pressing record, saying he was sorry for doing it this way. I thought about how much he had loved me and how love, when it comes down to it, is not a feeling but a series of decisions, and his last ones had been the right ones, even if he had waited too long to make them. "He did good work," Ms. Vickers said. "He always did," I said. "He just needed someone to follow through on it." She was quiet for a moment. "Then you didn't hesitate." The civil judgment was enforceable immediately. Their attorney filed for a 90-day delay on the grounds of asset liquidity. The court granted it. The judgment would be paid. Ms. Vickers made that clear. It was a matter of when, not whether. My daughter-in-law's CPA license came under review within 30 days of the court's referral. The LLC was dissolved. The receiving accounts were frozen pending the IRS investigation. The professional infrastructure she had built over 2 decades, the clients, the referral network, the reputation she had cultivated so carefully, collapsed with a thoroughness that I suspect she had not anticipated when she first looked at Jerome's retirement account and decided it was an opportunity. My son called me once after the ruling. I answered because he was still my son, and whatever that meant now, it still meant something real. Some things persist past the point where they are comfortable. He sounded tired in a way that had nothing performed about it. He said, "I knew it was wrong. I told myself it was just money, that you'd never notice, that Dad was sick anyway." I said, "Don't make that your story. You knew exactly what you were doing." He didn't argue. That at least was honest. I said, "I love you, and what you did was a profound betrayal. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I am not going to pretend that one of them cancels the other." He said, "I know." I ended the call. My daughter flew in from Denver the weekend after the ruling. She had known since February. I had told her before the hearing because she deserved to know, and because I was tired of managing information in ways that served no one. She had been quiet on the phone for a long time after I told her. A specific kind of quiet, the kind that belongs to someone rearranging something they thought they understood. Then she had said, "I'm coming." We sat on the back porch together the first evening, looking out over the raised garden beds Jerome had put in the spring before he died. The beds were still there, waiting. The April light was soft and slanted and didn't ask anything of either of us. She said he would have liked Ms. Vickers. I said he respected people who showed their work. We sat with that for a while, and it was enough. Later that spring, I went back into Jerome's study and stood in front of the bookshelf for a long time. I did not put the technical manuals into donation boxes the way I had planned. I arranged them the way Jerome had kept them, by year, by system type, and I left the HVAC manual at the end of the bottom shelf where it had always been. A little heavier in the back than it should be, a little heavier than it looked. I planted the garden beds in May. Tomatoes, peppers, the basil Jerome always forgot to water. The ground was cold when I started and workable by the time I finished. Lucinda came and helped, because that is the kind of person she is. We worked without talking much, which is, I have decided, the very best kind of company. The IRS findings were finalized in the fall. The Board of Accountancy ruling stood. My daughter-in-law's license was formally revoked. When I heard, I did not feel triumph, exactly. I felt something quieter and more durable, the feeling Jerome had once described to me when he finished a complicated repair. Not dramatic, just right. The load bearing what it was always supposed to bear. Jerome used to say, measure twice, cut once. He meant it about HVAC systems, about the technical work he had spent his life doing. But it was true about people as well, about trust and what you do when it fails you, about the difference between being soft and being weak, which is not the same difference at all. Soft things absorb pressure. They hold. They do not always. Grief makes you open in ways you are not expecting, and the wrong people understand exactly how to use that opening. But being open is not the same as being without recourse. Knowing the difference is something you learn, sometimes slowly, sometimes exactly when you need to. If someone who loved you left you something hidden, go and find it. You deserve to know what they were trying to say. What would you have done in my place? I would genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below and tell me what city you're listening from. Thank you for being here with me today.